here to discuss a rather grim but absolutely critical topic that I know you're all interested in or you wouldn't be here. I want to start by just thanking my co-organizers of this event, who are already mentioned, Isaac Jabola Carolis, Els de Gras, and also, I don't know where she is, in the back, Veronica Ordaz, and all four of us coordinated, and everybody worked really hard to make this happen, as well as all the staff here at the Murphy Institute, some of whom you see running around doing things in the background, and we're really grateful to their help. It's the kind of thing that's only visible when it doesn't work, and so hopefully you won't notice it too much, but they're really critical to the success of these events. Okay, so I know that everyone in this room is already aware of the ways in which our new president, Mr. Trump, has exploited the issue of immigration and stirred up his xenophobic base. Our goal today is to learn about the challenges this involves for us, for progressives, and especially labor-oriented progressives, and what some leading organizers and advocates are doing in response. That latter topic is really the focus in the afternoon. This morning, in this opening session, we're going to hear from two experts on the topic of immigration. It's the opposite of what's on the program. We're going to go in a different order. They're just alphabetical here. We're going to start with May Ngai, who is a history professor and has a more honorific title, the Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies at Columbia. And she's been writing about immigration for many years. I want to mention that she has a history in the labor movement as well. She worked for District 65 and its Consortium for Worker Education many years back. And she is the author of what, to my mind, is the best single book on the history of immigration. It's a real classic that some of you probably know about. It's called Impossible Subjects: Illegal Aliens in the Making of Modern America. But that's only one of her many publications. I'm not going to take the time to rehearse them, but we are very lucky to have her here. She's now at work on a comparative study of gold miners, Chinese gold miners, and racism in California, Australia, and South Africa. That's something to look forward to, but that's not what she's going to talk to us about today. Instead, she will try to give us a historical perspective on the present dilemma that we face in terms of immigration. And I'll go ahead and introduce our second speaker for the morning now, who's another person with a labor movement background. Instinctively enough, we turn to them as the best experts around on these topics, but they also have that connection. Muzaffar I first met many years ago when he worked for a union that no longer exists called the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, that some of you may recall, the one that brought you the Union Label song long ago and all that. And then he worked for its successor, Unite, which was an amalgam of that union and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, and I guess is now part of a new amalgam, Unite here, that you probably know about. But now, Muzaffar is a lawyer and currently serves as director of the Migration Policy Institute's New York office, which is at the law school at NYU. And he has been following and deeply engaged in immigration policy at every level for many years now. I don't know how many years. We both have too much gray hair to mention the numbers, but for a very long time, and really knows as much as anybody on the planet about this topic. So we're very fortunate to have his expertise here today. So I think I'll just leave it at that. There's much more to say about both of them, but we want you to enjoy their remarks, not just their credentials. So here's the plan for the morning. Each of our speakers will have a maximum of 30 minutes to present, and we have a authoritarian timekeeper here, Isaac, right in the front, who will remind them if they are tempted to go over time. And that will leave us plenty of time for discussion and questions and answers at the end before lunch, okay? And I think there is more coffee and breakfast food on the way if any of you are hungering for it. So you may see that appear sometime during this session. So we'll start with May Ngai. Thank you very much. And you're going to just sit here and talk, yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
I'm a little more comfortable and everybody can see.
And,
okay.
and May has a PowerPoint, which you should be able to see from wherever you're sitting,
right.
Although not if you're in the very front. Yeah, okay.
Okay, no, there's a...
Oh, there's one there, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Ruth, and thanks to the Murphy Center for hosting this. I very much look forward to today's discussions, especially since it's oriented around activism. So I thought as the guest invited to speak about historical context, I would focus on two questions. rather than give a broad historical overview, which many of you probably already know. So I want to focus on law and resistance, a historical view of the laws that govern our immigration policy, and on resistance. Oh, so I have this thing here. Okay, so the legal question I want to discuss is what is the source of the government's authority over immigration? Now, just last week was the 135th anniversary of the signing of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. And on this occasion, there were events held around the country. There was a big rally for inclusion that was held in San Francisco that had 1,000 people come out. And as you might imagine, many comparisons were made between Chinese exclusion and the proposed Muslim ban, the so-called Muslim ban, comparing racial and religious hatred and its drive towards exclusion policies. And what I want to talk about is not just that analogy, which is, of course, apt, but what I want to talk to you about is the direct line in the justification for the Muslim ban that goes to Chinese exclusion, right? That the legal justification for Chinese exclusion is what justifies, in the minds of the administration and its lawyers, the Muslim ban. And that is the rooting of immigration policy and regulation in national security. The idea that immigration is a national security interest. That was not always the case, right? So I think the important thing about history is you look to origins of certain policies, but then you realize that policies were not always the way they seem to have been. So there's nothing written in stone on how policies develop. They're all come out of historical context, and they can also change. So what is the source of the government's authority over immigration? So as I said, it wasn't always in national security. It changed over time. So before the Civil War, there was no federal regulation of immigration. It was a matter of the states. And the southern states, as slaveholding states, did not want any interference from the national government with its slave property, right? So there were debates over whether or not immigrants were passengers, right, or persons, right? Because if they were passengers, then it was seen that it could justify some regulation over the movement of slaves. But if they were considered persons, then it became more complicated because slaves were considered property. So, so basically, there was no resolution of this problem until after the Civil War. In 1875, excuse me, was when the Supreme Court ruled that regulation over immigration was a matter of the federal government's responsibility. And it located that authority in the Commerce Clause, right? And with the idea that immigrants are articles of commerce. And that sounds weird to us. It actually sounds like, you know, something that would uphold the regulation of slaves, right? Although slavery was abolished. But if you think about it, of immigrants mostly as workers, right? It is part of, you can see that it's part of commerce. And in 1889, after the Chinese exclusion laws were passed and when they were challenged by Chinese immigrants, the Supreme Court ruled that immigration is a matter of national security. And it, as an incidence of protecting the nation's sovereignty, right? So this elevated it to quite a considerable different level of understanding as a matter of commerce to a matter of the nation's survival, right? So to speak, its sovereignty. And what it did in doing that is that it located immigration outside the purview of the Constitution, and it put it in the same bucket with the other tasks associated with the conduct of foreign policy, such as Congress's authority to declare war on foreign nations, to make treaties, and conduct foreign policy in general. So with this came a doctrine of the plenary power. And so this is, I'm sorry, this is a long quote, so I just tried to underline the key phrases here. This is in the decision in the case that challenged the Chinese exclusion laws, which he lost, in which the Supreme Court says that To preserve its independence and give security against foreign aggression and encroachment is the highest duty of every nation, right? And to attain these ends, nearly all other considerations are to be subordinated. And now here's the interesting part where they say, it matters not in what form such aggression and encroachment come, whether from the foreign nation acting in its national character, meaning a foreign state or government, or from vast hordes of its people crowding in upon us. If therefore the government of the United States, through its legislative department, considers the presence of foreigners of a different race in this country who will not assimilate with us to be dangerous to its peace and security, the exclusion is not to be stayed because at the time there's no actual hostilities with the nations of which the foreigners are subject. Okay, this still stands. Okay, now what does that mean? It means, for example, that immigrants are agents of foreign states, either directly or indirectly, right? That all immigrants are potentially soldiers, right, or agents of foreign governments. It also says that people of a different race, presumably than white Anglo-Saxons, Protestants, can be considered dangerous to the peace and security of the nation. And you'll note here that it conflates, right, or it makes country, right, a state government, and a race kind of the same thing, right? So it sees nations as races. So this is surprising to a lot of people, but this is the grounding of how the Supreme Court justified the exclusion of entire race of people by saying they are really the advance guard of a foreign invasion. Now, I think many people would agree that migration is overwhelmingly a practice by people who are seeking economic improvement. Sometimes it's political, but usually they're fleeing their home country, not acting as agents or infiltrators from another country. And I think at this time it's really kind of a double irony because until the late 19th century, the Qing government, the Chinese government, prohibited emigration, right? It didn't want its people to leave. And you could also, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out the United States was settled by many colonials who came with royal patents, right? Who came actually as agents or with the authority of their, the British crown. Now, this was aimed at justifying the exclusion of Chinese and not Europeans, right? And I think it's worth noting that notwithstanding this ruling, the Immigration Bureau was located in the Department of Labor, right, which is more consonant with the idea that immigrants come to work and for economic improvement, not for political infiltration. And it didn't move out of labor. It moved into the Justice Department in 1940, and that was on the eve of the Second World War. But a broad principle was established, and in a later Supreme Court case, which justified deportation as a matter of the plenary power, in a dissent, Justice Brewer warned, he says, well, it's true, this is aimed at what he called the obnoxious Chinese, but who's to say it won't be used against others, right, in the future? Now, I think, I will just say parenthetically that immigrants often do retain ties to their home countries. Those ties are both affective and also sometimes political. And this is, I think, probably most often in the case when there are barriers to inclusion in the host country. But this is not the same as saying categorically that all immigrants are agents of foreign countries or that they bear primary loyalty to their home country. So if we think about the Muslim ban, this last phrase of this quote from the Supreme Court, that just because there are no actual hostilities, I mean, actually now the United States does consider us to be in a war, right, against terror, which is very hard to define, actually, what that is. It's very fuzzy. So the idea that the Chinese are not assimilable, right, which is the core of this racial argument, is very much the same as what's argued today by people who support this Muslim ban, that Muslims are by definition not, well, they're kind of anti-American, right? I mean, Trump has said Islam hates us, right? And there's also another argument that's been put forth by, I think, Kelly of DHS that Islam is not a religion, that's an ideology, right, and therefore extends this idea of hate. Okay, so what does the plenary power actually mean? So in this use, plenary means absolute, right? So to say that the Congress has plenary power over immigration regulation, this means it has absolute authority. What that means is that it can arbitrarily deny entry and summarily remove aliens, right? That aliens have no presumptive right to enter or to remain in the country. And in the enforcement of its immigration laws, the government has broad discretion, so things like extreme vetting or excluding anybody it wants to, setting the grounds and procedures for removal, et cetera. Most importantly, I think for many of us here who are concerned about escalation of deportation, deportation was defined by the Supreme Court in another Chinese exclusion case as not being a punishment for a crime, right? Violation of immigration law is considered a civil offense. And what that means concretely is that deportation procedures are not governed by the constitutional protections that people are afforded in criminal procedures. So Fourth, Fifth, Sixth Amendment rights that we assume apply to people in criminal proceedings do not pertain to deportation hearings. Now that's been changed a little around the edges, but to this day, immigrants do not have a right to a lawyer, right? And they certainly don't have a right to a lawyer at government expense if they can't afford one, right? That's why what New York has done is so important in terms of guaranteeing legal assistance to people in deportation hearings. They don't have a right to a speedy trial. There's no presumption of innocence, right? You have to prove that you have a right to be here. We have a de facto application of deportation laws. So if they've defined certain criminal offenses, even minor ones, as being deportable, even if you did that 20 years ago, you could still be deported for it today. There's no statute of limitations on unlawful presence. They can use evidence in a deportation hearing that would not be admitted in a criminal trial, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, and very importantly, I'm sure many of you know that deportation proceedings are generally not subject to review by a judge, except for habeas corpus writs. You don't have the right to an appeal, right? Now that's also changed a little bit around the edges. But importantly, in 1996, when IRA was passed, they passed a whole category of offenses for which you could be deported. They called it mandatory removal with no judicial review, right? So there's a whole range of offenses now where you don't have the right to go before a judge, and judges cannot use their discretion to say, well, you've had a really good record, you've been here for a long time, you have a family, et cetera. They can't do that anymore. Okay, so with the Muslim ban, the administration based its authority of its order in this kind of notorious section of the INA, Section 212F, which basically articulates the plenary power, right, as a national security interest, right? Whenever the president finds that entry of any aliens or class of aliens, any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the president may deem necessary and may suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens or impose any restrictions as he sees fit. Now, the questions before the courts right now, there's 30 ongoing cases on the Muslim ban. Right now, it's not in operation because we have all these restraining orders and injunctions. So now these cases are making their way through the courts. The first one, I think, was just heard this week. And the question for the courts was the ban aimed in the national security interest, or is it religious discrimination? So if they find it's in the national security interest, right, they would probably uphold it, right, given this long lineage of immigration being rooted in that. Okay, so So what's interesting is that nobody is questioning this idea that immigration, I mean, that's become normative, right? That immigration is a national security interest, right? So I think in a larger question, we have a lot to say about immigration being about families, about workers, about refugees, and the national security interest perhaps should not be the sole determining or the bottom line in our immigration law. Okay. All right, so now I want to turn to resistance, and I want to make the argument that our best analogy for resistance is the resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act and the Underground Railroad before the Civil War. A lot of people have talked about sanctuary having a history in the 1980s around the sanctuary movement to protect and defend Central American refugees. But I want to offer this as a broader kind of analogy, and this is a map of that Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, we might think of having its origins with a New Yorker, an African-American, a free African-American named David Ruggles, who lived at 26 Lispenard Street down in Tribeca. And he was very concerned about children being snatched up off the streets, black children, free black children being snatched up off the streets in the 1820s by slave kidnappers, right? This is kind of what we saw in that story of Solomon Northrop, right? 12 years a slave. He was basically kidnapped. So he formed a vigilance committee in New York City where people would watch out for these slave catchers and then would protect the children. They would get them off the streets, and they would, they would conduct basically community patrols. And this idea spread, and vigilance committees were formed throughout many cities in the North and the Midwest. Ruggles also then was using his home in Tribeca to give shelter to fugitive slaves, one of which was our most famous, Frederick Douglass, who, actually, I think he's still with us, right? He's had a very long life. And he married Douglass in his home, and so he stayed there for several weeks on his way.
He voted for Hillary now.
He's doing a really good job. So Ruggles' home was one of the first, stations, so to speak, of the Underground Railroad. And in the 1840s and 50s, as things started to heat up, states began to pass laws called personal liberty laws. Northern states, including Pennsylvania and others, passed basically laws that said that persons in their jurisdictions were free, right? And so that they would basically, it was a way to push back against the Fugitive Slave Act. And in 1842, in this case, Prigg, the Supreme Court ruled, and this is important for us today, that the federal government could not coerce states to enforce federal laws, right? So it ruled that, and this is what we see happening today, right? This tussle over, can the DHS and the administration force cities to cooperate with ICE removals? So on top of that, Wisconsin legislature passed a law basically nullifying the force of the Fugitive Slave Act in its state. That was overturned by the Supreme Court. But what I'm trying to suggest to you here is that there was a broad movement that was both from the top to the bottom, right, that operated in terms of legal challenges, local jurisdiction actions, and ordinary persons, right, abolitionists, who themselves worked both above ground and underground, right, so to speak, both above ground in terms of doing publicity work and having mass meetings against the Fugitive Slave Act. And even in the 1850s, in many places, there were crowds that formed outside of police stations where fugitive slaves were held, and they fought with, this is the kind of history I love, right? They fought with the cops, they freed people out of detention, right? So this is, we can imagine how intense this was. And a lot of historians believe that it was really the Fugitive Slave Act and the efforts to force it upon the North that really made the Civil War inevitable, right? That was the last straw for people in the North. In the same light, I think today we see a broad resistance to the Muslim ban and deportations. And again, I think it's really important that these are going on both, at the elite level in terms of court cases, litigation, as well as mass protests, civil disobedience, sanctuary, etc. As I mentioned, there are 30 ongoing cases against the Muslim ban now making their way through the federal courts. There's been 3 cases that I know of that were highly publicized of DACA holders who were apprehended, one of whom was deported. All 3 filed lawsuits against DHS. The 2 that were apprehended, the young man in Washington State and the Daniela Vargas, the one in Mississippi, who was apprehended right after she spoke at a rally. Right, what she was speaking about was ICE having broken into her home, and she hid in a closet while they took her father away. And then after that, she came and spoke at this rally denouncing what they had done to her family, and then they picked her up and ordered her deported. So she's also suing on grounds that her First Amendment rights were being violated, right? That she spoke out against ICE. So we'll see, we don't have yet, what I'm concerned about actually is the deportation executive order redefining the reach of expedited removal, and I'm sure you're going to talk about this probably, where now expedited removal has up to now been something practiced 100 miles from the border and applied to people who have been in the country less than 2 weeks. And now they've extended expedited removal to the entire interior of the country. Now, if you have been in this country if you're undocumented, but you've been here for 2 years, you have a right to a hearing, right? But it's hard to kind of figure out if they sweep somebody up, in Times Square, and how are you going to get your hearing if they say we're going to remove you expeditiously. So this is something that I think is certainly a question of due process that will probably come up in the courts. And on sanctuary, as many of, I'm sure you guys follow this, there was the restraining order or the temporary injunction against the threat against San Francisco and Santa Clara counties in California to withhold federal funds. But then we have Texas, which passed a state law requiring its own jurisdictions to cooperate with ICE and banning sanctuary in the state of Texas. So we'll have to see that. And then I'm sure many of you are involved in these trainings and networking, Know Your Rights and Rapid Response. I'm sure you guys are going to talk about that more later. And I look forward to learning from you about it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And now Muzaffar Chishti, who does not have a PowerPoint, but there is a handout that if you didn't pick it up on your way in, you can get on your way out, a fact sheet from his organization, the Migration Policy Institute, about the first 100 days. So
This is working, yeah. Thank you so much, Ruth. And I always accept any invitation where May is on the panel because it just gives me more time to take notes on immigration history, which I was busily doing today. So thank you so much for coming out today to reminisce about what the Trump first 100 days look like and what we project immigration policy in the Trump administration to look like in the near future. Let me just start with the obvious. This man made immigration a cornerstone of his campaign. It's hard to believe that he would have probably gone this far in the Republican primary if he had not made simple messaging things like the wall, the rapists, and the criminals as part of our messaging in the presidential campaign. It was extremely effective, and it caught It caught the attention, certainly, of good parts of the country, certainly outside the coasts. You also have to note something about Trump before he became president on immigration. Though you find his speeches to be rambling and repetitive and full of slogans, on immigration is one of the few things he had something very specific to say. If you actually got over his rhetorical flourishes, which he would ramble on, there was actually a lot of specific proposals that he projected in his speeches on immigration. In fact, I would say it was the most specific he got on any issue. And it's not surprising why it is. He gave his famous speech in Phoenix the afternoon he flew back from Mexico, because it's been over time drafted by the staff of Senator Jeff Sessions, who is now the Attorney General, was a leading proponent of restricted immigration in the Senate, and his staff person, Steve Miller, who's now one of the very important advisors in the White House. Sessions issued a handbook on immigration in January of 2015. It is much before Trump had announced any intention of running president, and much before anyone thought he could actually be president. So there are footprints on this immigration policy issue for a very long time. It didn't happen suddenly over the rhetoric in the campaign. So you could actually argue, probably convincingly, that he got elected because of immigration. And he kept his promise, the second thing I want to say. He actually ticked off everything he had said about immigration in his campaign, and one by one started issuing executive orders to keep his promise, at least to his constituency. He issued rapid order executive orders, many of them very robust, and we'll talk about them in a second, with the idea that I had an agenda, I told you what I was going to do, I'm the president, I'm now going to do it. And I would say again, on this issue, more than any other national agenda, he actually kept his electoral promise and delivered on them. So unfortunately, sadly, he hit, ironically, the first wall on immigration. He issued his executive order on travel ban, which I generally don't like to call Muslim ban because it's hard to defend in many quarters whether it's the Muslim ban or not. Whatever you want to call it. It's ban on entry of certain people from certain countries and banned for about 6 months on all refugees, strong vetting of people who choose to enter the United States. Entry ban. And he, within one day of his issuing the order, he was stopped by one federal judge in Brooklyn. And I was actually abroad when that happened. You couldn't believe what people thought about it. They could not believe that a single judge sitting in Brooklyn could tell this president of the United States, you could not do what you just chose to do. And I would tell you, Trump himself could not believe that a single judge sitting in Brooklyn could tell him that he could not do what he chose to do. So he hit his first wall, and we hit our first trial of constitutional democracy in the context of immigration in the Trump administration. And we all know what happened. Judges all across the country, democratically appointed, Republican appointed, in a sort of a chorus, told the president, you can't do, at least easily, what you think you can do. The first case to issue the judgment on this was in the state of Washington, a case brought by the Attorney General of the state of Washington, not by immigrant advocates. A different set of actors were entering into the debate to resist the president. And a temporary restraining order was issued. That went to the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit affirmed, and the president could not believe that the Ninth Circuit was affirming it, and he chose to call them all kinds of names, but he rescinded the order. And he issued a new order on March 6th. New order basically did pretty close to what the old order had done, except a few things. It removed Iraq as a country whose nationals could not come, and it removed the preference for minorities, which meant Christians, in the refugee stream, which they thought had created a problem for them in the first set of lawsuits. And guess what? That executive order was quickly challenged, and judges all across the country started ruling on them. Number of cases, and Judy's right here from the ACLU, and he can tell you more about this than any one of us can. They brought lawsuits all across the country. There were 3 lawsuits only, which I want to mention. One was in the Federal District Court in Maryland, one in Hawaii, and one in Virginia. Except the court in Virginia, which said that the president's issuing orders was sort of within his broad authority, sat in the boundaries of his authority, I think was the right word. Other district courts said you could not do this. And they were both challenged. And argument on one was held on Monday. In the Virginia case, in the Maryland case, the argument in the Hawaii case is going to be held on 15th in the Ninth Circuit case. I think what I want to say, especially in the context of what May was saying about the history, that it's actually, I think it has probably surprised a lot of people around the country, surprised a lot of lawyers also, as to how the courts have reacted so strongly to this issue. The issues in many ways are very similar to the issues that were debated at the end of the 19th century, or that were debated during the course of our chapters of history, including 9/11. Many of the actions that the president took have a lot of resonance with what George Bush and Ashcroft did after 9/11. Many of those raised similar issues, was brought to federal district courts, and we could not find a single federal district court to sympathize with the plaintiffs who brought the cases that time. And today, it's exactly the opposite. Almost every single court has said the president can't do it. And it always said that despite the fact with our strong history on this that May laid out so far, the context always matters. The judges at the end of the day are human beings. The judges after 9/11, the context was 9/11, and everyone could understand it. The context today is Trump. And that is creating, I think, a problem for a lot of them. We are seeing people raising the issues of the Establishment Clause in the immigration context. We're raising issues of the Guantanamo treatment of Guantanamo prisoners in the immigration context. So suddenly the kind of streams of case laws that you thought would never enter the immigration jurisprudence have entered the immigration jurisprudence in the context of the president's actions after 9/11 because it is Trump. So we don't know, frankly, I mean, I will be the last one to say we know how the Supreme Court is going to rule. Right. It's quite clear that this is headed to the Supreme Court. Whether there is division among the circuits on this issue, possible, but it's headed to the Supreme Court. And the problem is none of us can say what the Supreme Court is going to say for a variety of reasons. Many of these issues are what we call issues of first impression, that they have never gone to the Supreme Court in the way that these cases are getting framed in the courts below. And the second more important thing is the last time the Supreme Court ruled on the president's authority to do immigration was the Texas case, was the DAPA and the DACA, which we know the president lost because there was an 8-court Supreme Court bench which divided 4-4. And when you have a 4-4 opinion, you have no idea what the judges thought about the case. It's kind of a black box about where each judge is on this particular issue. So we have no idea where the 4 judges who voted one side and the 4 judges who voted on the other side stand on this issue. So you have to go completely on the assumptions if you think what the court is going to do. And most importantly, the last thing on this is that we now have a 9th Supreme Court judge. So the court is a different court than it was at the time of the Texas case. So a lot of speculation on this case. So let me just finish because I don't want to do lawyer talk here, glad to do in the question answer. So I think when the courts reacted so strongly to Trump, the general assumption in the country and around the world was that, yeah, there was a lot of noise, a lot of sort of rambunctious nonsense in the ramblings of the president, but there is not much bite in what he is doing. That he'll make a lot of noise, but there won't be a lot of bite, because it looked like in the context of his entry bans, he was being stopped. But, you have to say that courts, we don't know how the courts are going to finally come out, but despite the fact that he has been prevented on this issue, there is significant amount of new footprint that's been placed on immigration with huge outcomes, which we have yet to know the full consequences of, and I guess that's why we're spending the whole day on the conference here. I hate to talk about Trump in black and white terms, though it's very tempting to talk about Trump in black and or white and orange terms. Pick your. But I like to think that you can put Trump's actions on immigration in three buckets. One is where he has been completely stopped and potentially will be stopped for a long time, if not forever. Second, a bucket in which there is a lot of noise but not that much bite. And the third, where there have been real outcomes which we all must take seriously. I just finished the first bucket, will tell you where he has been stopped. I do think that he will probably be stopped on the sanctuary issue also. I think as May rightly pointed out, there's a lot of good case law from the historical times where courts have said that you can't force states to do something at the gunpoint. They're actually conservative judges mostly. Justice Kelly is the author of two of the most important judgments on this issue, that federal government cannot force states to do something and threaten them with funding and other sources. So I think the case law on that stuff is hugely in favor of sanctuary cities. So I'm less sort of, I think that will be somewhat of a problem for the president also. But he issued an order on border. He issued an order on interior enforcement. That wall will be built, 5,000 more Border Patrol officers will be recruited. We will increase expedited removal. He hasn't increased it, by the way. There's also a potential plan of increasing expedited removal. And we'll give all U.S. attorneys a lot of power to increase sort of criminal actions related to the southern border. And the interior enforcement, they rescinded the priorities memo of President Obama's administration. They want more 287G agreements to be signed. They want 10,000 more ICE officers to be recruited. They want, I'm sorry, let me just go on. And, they want sanctuary jurisdictions too. That came out of the executive order. So I think some of these orders, important as they are, I think are a little more noise than bite. The wall, first of all. I don't think the wall is going to get built. The Congress has obviously refused to give him money to do that. Congress, I think, will continue to give him the level of money that it takes to build the wall. There'll be some prototypes. So listen, we have tried to build virtual fences, real fences for a long time, and they don't generally work. And we also know now that these are private landowners in most of this southern borders, and they're going to resist it. There's going to be environmental studies. The wall is not going to be built anytime soon. As I said, I think the sanctuary stuff is also going to be not happening for quite some time. I think the expedited removal may or may not happen. I think it's still sort of in the exploratory stages. And I think a lot of some of you are interested in the H-1B issues with respect to temporary workers. He did issue an executive order. My own feeling is that there's a lot of more noise on that than bite in those things. But on the other hand, concluding on this, there are a number of issues on which real outcomes have already taken place. To me, the most important thing is in the Interior Enforcement Memo. By changing or rescinding President Obama's, and I would say particularly President Obama's orders on that in the last 2 years of his presidency. Obama administration had a rather checkered career on deportations. It did not start well. That's why people thought he was the deporter-in-chief and people thought he had earned the title. But I must say, just as an observer of this phenomenon, it hugely improved over time. In the last 2 years of his administration, I think they had gotten it almost right, that we're going to focus our energies on real criminals and people who deserve sort of leniency and at least our somewhat of compassion will not be removed. In fact, it was our assessment, MPI assessment, by the time the President Obama left his office, pretty close to about 85% of unauthorized people in this country were not a priority for removal. And they had managed to penetrate that deep into various parts of the ICE's bureaucracy where real ICE officers had no choice but to obey the orders of the central government. Now, all that was removed. The priorities memo was rescinded. The Secure Communities, which was a program that President Obama ended, was reinstated. And essentially, they said, yes, criminal aliens are still our priorities. But that doesn't mean that anyone else who comes in our view while we're doing a criminal activity will be spared. Essentially, everyone became a priority. And when you have no priorities, really everyone is a priority. There are no sacred spaces left. The case that you heard, if we're going to go to a home looking for someone who has an old outstanding removal order, it may be fine to remove, but while we're in the apartment, we find his wife and we find his young daughter, they're fair game also. So that is the new footprint. And we have seen, obviously, the outcomes of this are happening. The arrests have gone up in about 33% since he became president, last 3 months. The arrests of people with no criminal convictions have gone up about 50%. People with criminal convictions gone up about 15%. On the other hand, the number of removals from the country actually slightly declined. Not because I think they don't want to remove people, but any of you know anything about immigration processing, it takes a while from the time you arrest people to the time you can actually physically remove them from the United States. So we believe the removals will start going up. Second is apprehensions have really gone down, hugely. Apprehensions have gone down 65% in the last 6 months. So the president's narrative, which is, I think, the most important here in the context of these memos, is that there's a new sheriff in town, that ICE officers have had their handcuffs taken off, and that you must remove every potential unauthorized immigrant that comes in your sight, and you're free to do that. And combination of that and the travel ban have gotten the message of the narrative out that this is a new day in the world of immigration in the United States. Apprehensions, obviously, are an important factor of that. When you know about the people moving these unaccompanied kids who have been coming to the U.S. in the last 5 years. The number of unaccompanied kids coming down to the United States has dropped 77% in the last 3 months. The number of families accompanying the unaccompanied kids, which had gone hugely in the last 2 years of the President Obama's administration, has gone down to about 88% in the last 3 months. 33 states in the country have introduced or actually passed legislation asking their local jurisdictions to become more effective in immigration enforcement. Texas is the model of that law which passed about 2 days ago. On the other hand, just to be fair, there are states like California which are going in the other direction, basically saying that we will never cooperate with anything to do with federal enforcement. So you're seeing sort of actions on this on both sides of the spectrum. Last time I checked, 7 new jurisdictions have signed 287G agreements, giving local police authority to enforce immigration law. If you look at the travel statistics, from the Middle East, travel has gone down to about 8% in the last 3 months. The Emirates Airlines has said that 20% of their flights have been canceled because of lack of interest of people coming to the United States. The travel industry, which I do strangely follow quite a bit, has reported that they believe that 4.3 million less people will come to the United States in 2017, which will cost us about $7.4 billion in the economy. They project in 2018 about 6.3 million fewer people will come to the United States with a cost of $10.8 billion to our economy. We know that reporting of crimes has gone down hugely in major urban areas of the country. We know reporting of domestic violence has gone down hugely in many parts of the country. We know, despite the fact that people think about H-1B visas as the visas that everyone wants to apply for, 199,000 people applied for H-1B visas in the first week of April, but that's 20% less than people applied last year. Even techies find it difficult to be able to come to the United States. You all saw that rather front-page business section New York Times article yesterday. A lot of techies from Silicon Valley are starting their offices in Canada because they don't think that they can get workers to come to the United States. So if you look at the combination of these things, you know that a lot of both direct and perceived things have already started happening. But let me tell you what troubles me the most about the Trump administration's immigration stuff so far. It has nothing to do with anything that I said so far. It's actually good with one of the papers that's out there, whether Ruth put it or no. It's that there is an agenda embedded in the Trump administration's executive orders, which a lot of people haven't paid attention to, which is about public relations. There is huge effort to collect data, to analyze data, and disseminate data in a very organized way. And they have started already acting on it. You're supposed to issue weekly reports on every immigrant who is in any jail in the country on a weekly basis. You're supposed to issue monthly data on how many immigrants were arrested where and what their background was. And you're supposed to issue quarterly reports on every jurisdiction in the country which has decided not to follow cooperative arrangements with the federal government. This is, and then keep on drumming this out in the public stream. This is what I point out in my article. This is what Breitbart would do about African American crimes, that they would not publish crimes done by ordinary people. They just publish crimes committed by African Americans. This is what Nazis did during the Nazi time, that crimes of all Germans were not publicized. Only crimes of Jews were publicized in the Nazi days. I'm not the first person to point it out, other people have pointed it out. But I have been extremely intrigued about the public relations agenda because guess what? It goes back to where it goes back to where President started his campaign. It's all about messaging. Whether his executive orders are taking the bite that he wants, in the public arena, they will project the image that they are creating a bite. They establish an office in ICE about victims of crimes committed by unauthorized people. It's called Voice. Just to publicize and tell those families on a constant basis who the perpetrators of this. So to me, one of the most important factors of this is a rather pervasive, what I chose to call muscular public relations campaign as part of the president's agenda. I don't want to shock you. There was a report that finally got released by AP yesterday, that they're thinking of removing TPS from Haitians. And political appointees within DHS are sending emails to career officers at ICE. But please start finding us anything you can find on Haitian recipients of TPS who are Haitians. Find how many of them use public benefits, how many of them have some criminal record, so that you could see Haitian TPS has not been lifted as yet. But I can already see what is at work here, is to project an image at the time which would justify why Haitians should not get temporary protected status. We have never just cleaned up on this. We have never used individual characteristics of people to decide whether someone gets TPS or no. It's all about the country conditions, and we're going to go in that direction. So let me conclude by saying there's one thing here where the president, which is kind of strangely an outlier, where he hasn't kept his promise of elections, which is to get rid of DACA. He campaigned that this was executive amnesty, and he has chosen not to do it. And despite the individual cases, and I think there are a couple of more that have come to our attention in the last 2 or 3 days, he has chosen not to touch the kids so far. We know the DACA applications are being received, they're being approved, DACA renewals are being accepted, and they're approved. So there doesn't seem to be any real change in rescinding the DACA. What the future of DACA is, we don't know. We hope, and this is where you have to put, as I said, you can't put Trump in any neat thing, but you have to hope that this may lead some legislative fix on the DACA, where he can actually live to his electoral promise that, look, I thought you can't do this administratively, but Congress can do it, and they have the heart to do it because of the young people. So there may be hope in DACA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Muzaffar. So we have about a half hour for comments, questions, et cetera, from the floor. Let me ask that anyone who, are there microphones around for this, folks? Anyone who speaks, please identify yourself, and please be respectful of the large audience and keep your comments brief. Where are the mics? Oh, great. Okay, let's start with you.
I have a question about the government.
Could you please say who you are?
Oh, my name is Dina Fisher. I'm associated with the New Sanctuary Coalition of New York City. The issue of if a parent abandoned a child, they would be prosecuted or something. If the government creates that abandonment, which they seem to be doing, is there any effort on the part of the legal community? I don't know if you can prosecute the government, but to prosecute the fact that they are causing whatever you would say about children being abandoned by taking parents away who are driving their kid to school or walking down the street. Is there anything out there
I mean,
that's
that's not the
happening? And is
government's,
it-
yeah, that's not the government's position. The government's position is that these kids should go back with their parents.
Well,
They're
if he's
saying
a citizen of the U.S.
They
They're not
should
going
go back-
to
yeah,
deport the
Their position is that
child.
they should go back with the parent. And if the parents choose to leave them here because they're U.S. citizens, parents have made that decision. The government did not force them to make that decision. I mean, that's, I think, what the government's consistent case has been.
Thank you. You're next, yeah.
Wondering if
Please
either
say who
of
you
us-
are.
Oh, sorry, forgive me. Bruce Rosen. I was a city planner for New York City. I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about who benefits economically from doing this. For example, well, New York State has never privatized any of its jails or prisons. The feds had that, and towards the end of the Obama administration, the president said, we are getting out of the business of contracting out. So the only facilities in New York were the immigration, so-called immigration holding facilities. The stock of those companies went up dramatically when Mr. Trump came in. So in addition to that, who else is benefiting, and shouldn't we once again follow the money on this?
Well, you're absolutely right that the whole private immigration detention and prison industrial complex benefits from these policies. I don't actually think that, economically, if you were to deport millions, let alone 11 million undocumented people, it would be terrible for the economy. But I don't think that the goal of the administration is to deport 11 million people. The goal of the administration is to frighten 11 million people. So they will keep their heads down, so they will, not ask for benefits, so they will, so I think that the agenda here is a political one. It's not an economic agenda, it's a political agenda, as Moose outlined very clearly for us. And it's an agenda that it's a nativist protectionist agenda. He's going, and at the same time, he's going around promising to bring coal jobs back. It's all, he's not going to do that, right? But this is all about this America first, America centric. It's a nativist, it's a protectionist agenda. And the trade, I think, goes along with immigration in appealing to his base. So on immigration, they're not going to deport 11 million, but you don't know if you're the one who's going to get deported or not, right? So it's a huge fear-mongering campaign that plays to his base, right? So all they need is a few spectacular raids on TV cameras to frighten immigrants on the one hand and to play to the nativist base on the other. And this is a huge distraction for everything else that they're doing in terms of health care, right? Russia, when you name it. You know, he has a hardcore political base that is built around this agenda, I think. So I think it's a political agenda. It's not, and the economics is happening somewhere else, right? It's happening with the corruption and the deregulation of businesses. And the economics agenda is a huge agenda. It's not directly, in my view, flowing from the immigration agenda. But the immigration agenda allows them to merrily go on deregulating business, you know, looking for tax cuts, et cetera, et cetera. That's my view.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's basically true, but I think, you know, again, I hate to put Trump in black and white terms. I don't think Trump's agenda on this was driven by follow the money.
Right,
I think
right.
May is absolutely right about it. It was driven by what's the populist agenda, what will sell. He wasn't thinking about companies when he thought about the wall. But companies are extremely eager to take advantage of his rhetoric and then the policy. So two things have already happened. The people who have purposely built the wall are all big construction companies. They are typically the companies that just finished the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, it's actually absolutely amazing. The biggest lobbyists on the Senate bill in 2013 were not the big lobbyists on the K Street. They were all big, these defense contractors coming off the war, where they knew was war going to end. They think, like half a mile before you and I do. They're looking at the next frontier for their company, and they had seen the possibility on. But that's exactly what's happening on the border. They were going to build 29 small prototypes, and there are construction companies lined up for those contracts already. Same is true for the jails. The president has said that I think we are already there are going to be 3,500 new detention beds built. We're going to have the capacity to retain 39,000 people on a daily basis in immigration. His announced intent was that everyone we arrest should be detained and not let go. So obviously the private prison companies have had their interest in this for a very long time. It's not surprising that almost everyone who leaves DHS gets to be an employee or a board member of a very prominent prison company in this country. But on your stuff about New York State, one of the few unnoticed things about it is that many of the states and localities are saying, look, we would like to hold these people, but these regulations of holding these civilians in immigration detention are so rigid, it's just too expensive for us to maintain them. Guess what? They're going to relax the restrictions on detention so that many of the state and local prisons would have the ability to detain these people, so that may be a significant boom to jails in New York State.
Can I just add one other thing in terms of the corruption involved here, is that these contracts that DHS has with immigration detention facilities, they get paid for the number of beds they have regardless if they're filled. So even though some of the detention centers along the Texas border have seen a decline in detentions, they're still getting their
money.
Their money, yeah.
We have a question way in the back. I can't see you, so I don't know who you are, but please identify yourself and.
Yes, my name is Jim Dingman. Two questions. First, a historical one. We're just a few blocks away from the site of the Colored Children's Orphanage that was burned down in 1863 during the draft riots. And I want to know from a historical perspective what Professor Ngai thinks about the question of the Irish American issue in the 19th century, because Irish Americans, as we know, at the end of the Civil War, set up armies to invade Canada. Irish Americans throughout the history of the United States have been intimately involved with Irish nationalism. If we look at the Easter Rebellion of 1916, it was critical to have Irish American financial and weapons support to allow that to happen. So how does that play into the narrative? And secondly, the question of national security. We're in a situation where what's lost a little bit in what's been happening in the past 100 days is essentially an expansion of our military involvement throughout the world. 5,000 troops to Afghanistan. In Africa Command, the delegation that the Africa Command commander can now initiate operations. And I'm wondering about the spillover effect and your thoughts of, let's say we're going to have another 9/11, what would that do to this whole scenario? Because it's inevitable that something may happen, and as we all know, more sober analysts say, the Trump policy is counterproductive to actually conducting those operations abroad. But what happens if we do have some incident, and what do you think will happen domestically?
Thank you.
It's interesting that you raised the case of the Irish Americans, and I mean, there was a very famous case, I'm blanking on the name now, where the U.S. government tried to denaturalize the Fenians, Irish Americans who were associated with the supporting the Irish Republican cause. So they do factor into this history, but over time the Irish have become, they become white, right? This is the kind of historical analysis about Irish, but it's not that simple, right? That they came and then they just became white. I mean, it's a much more complex history of labor relations with other groups. And the Irish suffered terrible restrictions in the 19th century in terms of employment and general prejudice, much of which was religious, right, in nature. But I think the thing to remember here is that before World War I, we had virtually no restrictions on immigration. There were some qualitative conditions that an alien had to meet. But there were no numerical restrictions, certainly no group-based restrictions, save for Chinese and other Asians. So during the peak Ellis Island years, only 1% of the people who showed up were turned away. Right? If you could come, if you were seen to be able-bodied, meaning you could work, you got in. So it's a very different. It was a very different period in which, I mean, at first people came because they wanted people to settle the country, right? I mean, there were the initial colonial settlers who I think is wrong to consider them immigrants. They were not immigrants, they were colonial settlers who took land from Native Americans, right? But even into the 19th century and through the middle of the 19th century, people from Europe, especially including Ireland, but also from Northern Europe, England, Germany, et cetera, were seen as necessary for building and expanding the nation itself, right? So the big push westward was done with a lot of pro-migration policies, meaning if you went to the Northwest Territory, what's now, Ohio, Michigan, et cetera, it was very easy to naturalize in a couple of years. You could vote even before you became naturalized. These were all incentives to get people to settle, open up the frontier, so to speak, and this kept pushing westward. And it's not till the turn of the 20th century where you had a large mass labor migration, right, that came into the cities, worked in the factories, really were the stuff of America's industrialization and urbanization, that you begin to have a real a kind of bifurcation in public opinion, right? There are those that recognize that the labor needs that immigrants met, and there were those who didn't want people who were different, right? Jews, Italians, right? People who were not Protestants, et cetera. And this leads finally to the 1920s, right? The World War I era regulations, which then puts us on a path of determining who's desirable based on what their perceived racial background is, right? But by this time, a lot of Irish have already been assimilated into the mainstream of American culture, even if they're still mostly in the working classes.
Ms., do you want to respond to the question about a
Yeah.
potential, terrorist incident or something and how that might change the
I was going to
context
talk
as you
about
put
the
it
Irish
before?
now.
Oh, well, that too, fine, both.
So, I mean, the only thing I'm always just being an immigrant, probably more than anything. I mean, I've always struck about how, despite what you read about our history, and how always we have been ambivalent about immigration, and it's not recent. It's about what we thought about Irish and what we thought about Germans. I mean, you should see what did Ben Franklin say about Germans in 1767? I mean, we have been.
Yeah, but nobody tried to stop them from coming.
Yeah, we just stop. But we have had issues with all waves of immigrants over the. But national security. I mean, I think you're right. We do, as I pointed out on the court cases, 9/11 was a very important backdrop to how courts reacted to those set of cases. If there is a major terrorist attack, don't be surprised if courts take a slightly different view. But just to be more positive about this, I think on these cases, even in the context of terrorist threats, I think courts are beginning to be getting more and more mature about these things. That even in these cases that we see, courts are saying that even if, as May laid it out, that we have given the president a lot of authority in deciding who should we let in on the basis of detrimental interest to the United States, courts are saying, well, we want to see we haven't seen any evidence why these people would be detrimental to the United States. That many judges are finding themselves being more assertive in not taking the word of the president on issues of what is detrimental to the United States or not.
And that's new.
That's new,
That's
and this is
new,
what we're saying. We do evolve as a country. I can't tell you that the Supreme Court is going to behave exactly the same way as lower court judges are behaving on this issue. But there is significant progress, and we should all be cognizant of that and all celebrate that. I mean, many of us were quite surprised as to how members of the Supreme Court were very, very receptive to what we did in Guantanamo. That you can't tell us that just because Guantanamo is outside the country, that is legal fiction, that our Constitution doesn't apply there. That we may have listened to that in the past, we are not willing to listen to that now. I mean, in that regard, I think we as a constitutional democracy do constantly evolve and, in my mind, actually improve.
Yes. Please wait for the microphone and tell us who you are.
I'm Nancy Lawrence. I'm working with the Consortium for Worker Education, giving workshops on immigrant rights. So my question is about this idea that the federal government can't force states to carry out federal policy. And I'm thinking back to like Sheriff Arpaio in Colorado, wasn't he?
Arizona.
Arizona. And how that would apply there. You know, here he is kind of taking immigration into his own hands, or was. And it seems like it could work both ways.
Well, that was struck down,
know,
right?
Sheriff Arpaio had to face Department of Justice charges, and not to mention he lost his election. So people get penalized. I mean, this is I don't want to be. I really want to say celebrate certain things about our country. SB 1070 is one of the most notorious laws in our history, Arizona's law, famous Show Me Your Papers. The author of that provision, Russell Pierce, was thrown out of office. It's the only time in the history of Arizona where someone was recalled in his election, a Republican guy, because he was the author of this 1070 measure, because major businesses around the country did a huge rally against Russell Pierce in Arizona, and he was thrown out. Arpaio, at the end of the day, faced criminal prosecutions and DOJ investigations that also lost his election. But Nancy, the point you're talking about is slightly different in terms of Arpaio was operating under 287G agreements. And 287G agreements are a contract between the federal government and the states and localities where those communities, including, willingly take on the role of the federal government. The case we are saying, the sanctuary city cases, are when the federal government is telling states and localities that if you do not honor our detainers, let's say for the example, we will
If you
withhold,
do not volunteer
we
to work with us.
we will withhold federal funds on you. That's like holding the gun. That's a different theory. And I'm saying the case law there is in favor of states, where conservative judges over time have said, you cannot force, this is what May was talking about even the earlier cases, you cannot commandeer, in the legal terminology, states to do your work, because that would be a violation of the 10th Amendment.
Please.
I think Judy's about to intervene.
Judy Rabinovitz with the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project. But I think that Nancy does have a good point, that there is a tension between sort of the arguments that we make about preemption, that certain things that the states do are preempted because the federal government sets immigration policy, and then there are other things that we feel like the states should be able to do, and the federal government shouldn't be able to commandeer them and tell them to do something different. So there are ways to explain where those distinctions are, but I don't think it's completely clean. And I remember being on a panel years ago with Chris Kobach, and it was like, who's the architect of many of the anti-immigrant provisions from the states, starting with Hazleton and going on through Arizona and whatever. And, it was like, we were talking about in-state tuition. Oh, we were talking about in-state tuition policies, and it was sort of like him saying, okay, well, here we reverse sides.
Yeah.
Like here, one of us is for preemption, and then the other one isn't for preemption. And so there are.
They're complicated, yeah.
I mean,
what's good for,
what's
good for goose is good for the gander,
Yeah,
is
so I do
where
think
this
it's a-
argument goes.
And it's an issue that we're cognizant of as we bring challenges to certain things in terms of what are the implications for our other arguments about preemption. I think there are distinctions that can be made, but I think there are tensions also.
And I think right now the case to watch is the Texas SB4 law, which on a state level bans sanctuary and basically requires all local jurisdictions to cooperate with ICE. And that's interesting because a state is requiring its cities and counties to enforce or to cooperate with a federal law enforcement. And I had a really hard time wrapping my brain around that.
It's a different preemption
It's
thing,
a different
but-
kind of preemption. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, and there are people who are, I read something yesterday by somebody from University of Houston Law School, immigration law clinic, who wrote a whole bunch of constitutional issues with the SB4. So we'll see how this plays out. And I think Moose is absolutely right. We don't know what the Supreme Court's going to say at the end of the day.
And that strategy is being used on other things too, like minimum wage laws in locals and cities and so on. So there's a lot going on in that area. I think you were next in the red jacket, or didn't you have your hand up? Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me, I must be hallucinating. I'm not sure who was next then. How about this person right here?
Hi, I'm Jackie Vimo. I'm with the National Immigration Law Center. Moose is one of our board members.
Hold it a little closer.
Sorry, with
Yeah.
co-counsel ACLU, we're the ones that brought the first Muslim ban lawsuit, and also representing Danny Vargas and Juan Montes, the two documented people that were arrested and deported. I'm also a scholar of immigrant and labor social movements, and the question I have for both of you is about the history of social movements getting involved in sort of this legal activism. And you've mentioned it's new, but I was in the courtroom when the Brooklyn sitting judge was making that decision. And when I walked outside, I couldn't believe it. I had no idea. I was live tweeting, and I walked out, and there were thousands of people on the street. And there were the JFK rallies and LAX and Dulles. And you've mentioned that in recent history this is new, but I'm kind of curious about the historical precedents for there to be immigrant social movements that engage with with a legal, like a judicial sort of decision-making process. And again, I know it's new in the current context, and as Moose said, context matters. I'm not with Robert Bork or Scalia that it's just the text, and so I'm just curious what the history of this is.
I think there's lots of examples, not just in immigrant rights, but also in all cases of civil rights and minority rights. The Civil Rights Act, right, or take Brown v. Board of Ed. That was a real sea change in that the court rejected, decades of precedents upholding segregation, and it did so because there was a public opinion about it, and that was already in 1954, right? So, courts have always found ways to say, oh, there's a new way to think about this, right? You can go back to protective legislation for women, right, where for the first time courts said it was, we could consider social science expertise. If you actually look at that social science expertise, it's not very expert at all from our viewpoint. But
As opposed
you
to
know,
historical expertise.
well, no, I mean, it said that working long hours is bad for women's health, right? But there was a labor movement, right, and a strong settlement house movement at the time that adopted that strategy. I mean, the strategy was not without problems because it kind of reified women as being the reproductive sex and therefore weaker and in need of protection. But that was a calculated decision to get around the freedom of contract rules, jurisprudence, right? So I think, I mean, as Moose said, I mean, judges are human beings. They live in, they are very tied to precedent and they're very conservative in that way, but they also live in the same world that we do and they're not immune from influence. So I think it's definitely the case that, what we do in the streets and, and on the ground matters a great deal in terms of, and I think that's why we see this difference now in the courts than we did after 9/11.
Well, I'd like to follow up on that with a question of my own, which I guess it's more for Moose than for me, but either of you could comment, which is, what about the court of public opinion, which is influenced by demonstrations and also reflects public opinion to some extent, but I believe the recent polling data on attitudes toward comprehensive immigration reform, et cetera, while there is the base for Trump that's very xenophobic, the majority of the population is much more sympathetic to the unauthorized population. So how does that figure into this whole dynamic and the context that we've been talking about? I know this has to be speculative, but I wonder what you both think about that.
Well, Jackie, I mean, you can educate all of us on this issue more than I can. I mean, I do think that, immigrant issues have become the new civil rights issues of our times. I mean, that's the basic change. That it did not attract this kind of traction, frankly, in the court of public opinion or on the campuses. This has suddenly become a sexy issue. Let's just be honest about it. Frankly, I don't see thousands of people going to the airport on labor issues, talking about in the labor community. Suddenly, this has become much more of a sexy issue than a lot of other issues for which all of us should be concerned about. And at some level, we should be debating that issue also. Mm-hmm. When did immigration issue become the sexy issues they have become? How many people march about Black Lives Don't Matter? Not in the same way, unfortunately, as we talk about immigration issues. So I think there is certain appeal to this issue which has grabbed people's attention, I think, in a way than in the past. Talk about law students. I mean, that lawsuit was brought by, law students in the wee hours of the morning. As I like to say, only law students are going to do it because no middle-aged man is going to get up at 5 in the morning to file a lawsuit. I think
they're just going to bed then. It's not that they get up at 5.
It looks like you seem to go to bed at that time. So it's I think there's a huge change in that regard. Let me say something else obvious on this issue also, which may know more about, but doesn't get talked about that much, is that, removals of people from our country, in the large numbers that we know, which grabs people's attention, like these kids getting, is actually a relatively recent phenomenon. People did not used to get removed from the inside of our country in these numbers as they have gotten removed in the last few years. Most removals happened, huge number of removals that happened historically. They would all happen at the border. When I entered immigration field, to get deported from this country was an extremely rare event. You would have to go to a garment factory, raid few people. I mean, this was really, the number of people, this was rare cases of removal. The fundamental change that happened, which is also, we should remind, that what we do today doesn't have consequence today, it is a consequence fair down in the stream. We are seeing all these effects of changes in the 1996 law, is that when we had the intersection between the criminal justice system and immigration is what has created the big funnel for removal of people that we did not used to see in the past, which is what has created sort of the new galvanizing effect for people to come and know a large number of people who are getting removed, whom we would never know in the past. And that's also, I think, what is affecting the body politic.
Okay, I think we have time for only one more question. I know you've had your hand up for a while, so I'm going to give it to you. But I know that our speakers will be around during the lunch period, so you can ask them informally if you have more questions. Could you say who you are, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. My name is Angie Kim. I'm a community organizer at Milkman Center. It's a small CBO in Queens. I'm also a dreamer and a DACA recipient. So I moved here with my family. I was 9 years old, and I've been undocumented pretty much all my life. So my question is for Professor May. So earlier we were talking about a couple of the instances of DACA recipients being criminalized and put under deportation proceeding or have been arrested. So this morning, actually, I just read another story in the New York Times of another dreamer and who's also a DACA recipient, Jessica Alt, I think, from state of Georgia. She's also been put under deportation proceedings recently. So it seems like Jessica actually had a prior felony charge from driving without a driver's license. Anyway, she served community.
felony?
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's actually it's right. Which I wasn't aware that it was a felony. Right, that's the second, right. So this actually occurred about 7 years ago, I guess. And so recently she was questioned by an officer, and she ended up, I guess, somehow giving a false address. So now she's under. She's charged with a felony, and she's put under deportation proceedings. So my question is, if you can just sort of comment on this, in the context of the conversation that you were having in regards to the DACA recipients, and what's interesting is that in the process of the DACA application, applicants are put under a criminal background check, and we actually do fingerprinting. So I feel like there's a bit of this policies from both sides where it kind of negates, right? Because if you've already been through a background check and you were able to receive DACA, obviously you shouldn't be deemed as a criminal. So Mike, I just want to know what your thoughts are on that.
I don't know about this particular case, and what I'm frightened about is that they're combing the files to see who they can find some legitimate reason to challenge somebody's DACA holdings. I don't know what is going on. I do think that on DACA, they seem to be talking out of both sides of their mouth, right? Or that they're saying some things and they're doing other things, which, the students I have who are DACA holders are very frightened. They don't know if they should apply for renewal. They're told that their authorizations are being renewed, and I believe they are being renewed, but they don't know if they're going to get renewed. So it's just made it very, very anxious time for all of you, right? And I think this is part of the strategy, right? Is to, on the one hand, he can say, "I love these kids," blah blah blah. On the other hand, they're finding people they can deport, and it's part of a fear campaign. I don't. We don't know what to tell. First we were telling our students, "Don't apply." Don't reapply. Then we were telling them, well, I guess you can apply. We don't know what to advise people because you don't know what they might turn up or what they might do. So it's a very uncertain and frightening time.
Do you want to add anything, Moose? Or?
Yeah, not really.
Okay.
I'm not sure this is a DACA-related issue. I think she was caught, obviously, because she was an activist. That's
the other thing, yeah.
And therefore, in the course of the activism, her prior admission came to light. And this is sort of where, if nothing is a priority, everything's a priority, she now fits. She had made an admission to a criminal offense, and now saying, here's a person who made admission in front of us. She should not have been given DACA either. She's a priority for removal. That's where the that's where I think the whole, because of the change in narrative, the complete atmosphere has changed. And that's, I think, what May's.
Oh,
trying
and
to
this is,
reflect
I
on.
didn't know she was an activist. I mean, this is like the Daniela Vargas, right? She spoke out and then they busted her. So this is really serious, right? Because, their rights to free speech and association are completely undermined by this. And I think this is something that the DACA movement's going to have to, I mean, each person's going to have to think about, and the movement's going to have to think about.